So good evening, everyone. My name's Helen Parr and I work for Devon Wildlife Trust on the Green Minds project in Plymouth. And Devon Wildlife Trust is a partner on this exciting Plymouth City Council-led project. It's funded by the European Regional Development Fund's Urban Innovative Actions and a unique opportunity to bring our experience and enthusiasm for wildlife and nature to the green and blue spaces in a large city like Plymouth. So the Green Minds project aims to put nature and wildlife at the heart of decisions made around Plymouth's green spaces. It's all about making space for nature while helping local people reconnect with the natural world and getting all the physical and mental health benefits that we know this can bring. So it's a win-win situation, really. And part of that is running events like this to raise awareness and get people involved. And we have lots of other events going on the Green Minds project. So you'll be able to look on the greenmindsplymouth.com website and there's an events section there and lots more about the project. So on to tonight's talk. We're going to learn all about hedgehogs and how we can help them. And our speaker tonight is Emily from Devon Wildlife Trust. And over to you, Emily.
Thank you. Sorry, that's a good start. Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen. Does that look okay, Helen?
Yes, yeah.
Super. Right, thank you very much. Just to say, this is my first online presentation since I've come back from maternity leave. So I'm used to sort of wandering around and doing lots of arm movements. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that at a desk, but hopefully it'll all be okay. So my name's Emily. I'm Terrestrial Conservation Officer at Devon Wildlife Trust. My main focus is Exeter Wild City, which is a community project in Exeter, and trying to get people out enjoying nature and working with the City Council on in a very similar way to Helen in Plymouth, actually. Tonight's focus is hedgehogs. So just to give you a little overview about what we're doing today, they're going to cover tonight. We're going to cover the hedgehog basics. So thinking a little about their breeding habitats, their habits, their diet, their behaviours, looking at their range, so where they can be found in the UK, but also in Europe and elsewhere, how they're doing, what their status is, why they're threatened, the problems they're facing, and how we can all help their recovery. So, European hedgehog. Hedgehogs in general, depending on which taxonomist you speak to, there are between 14 and 17 species of hedgehog worldwide. The one that we have is West European, or the common hedgehog. And you can see there that it's restricted mainly to the west of Europe. It's also found in New Zealand, where it was introduced, and unfortunately is considered a pest in New Zealand as it preys on native species and eggs and competes with other species for food. There are the other three species on that screen are Ethiopian, Algerian, and the long-eared down the bottom. They're in their own family. Their closest relative is possibly the shrew or mole in the UK. So there's nothing in the UK very similar. Obviously, they're the only species in the UK that has spines. And they have about 4,000 to 5,000 spines on their back. And these are modified hairs or quills made of keratin, so the same material as our hair and our nails. They change very little over the last 15 million years, so they've obviously done something right. It's only a human influence that seems to have set them back. They can live till about 10 years, but on average, really, they only last about 3 years. And they weigh about 500 grams to a kilo, and they need to be at least 500 to 600 grams to survive the winter when they hibernate. They're very adept. They can swim, they can dig, they can climb, so they can actually climb up small walls and steps, and they can swim across ponds, which is pretty impressive. And they've got surprisingly long legs, and they can run at about 7 kilometers per hour, which is actually quite a speed. It's a kind of a brisk walking pace for us, which I think is pretty impressive for such a small mammal. They don't feature a great deal in folklore, which I'm quite surprised at. but they do have a fair amount of significance to cultures over the years. So in Egypt, they've been associated in the past with rebirth because they retreat underground or into dens or hibernate when food is scarce, and they re-emerge when food is available again. So Egyptians thought that they had risen from the dead. They wore amulets in the form of hedgehogs, and you'd often find the figures like the one in the top left of the screen found in tombs. Not all cultures have seen them as a good thing. They're not so revered everywhere around the world. In Mongolia, they're traditionally believed that it's bad luck for a hedgehog to enter a person's home. And the reason for this is that they usually walk with their heads down, concealing their faces. And this is taken by Mongolians to mean that they're not open, they're not an honest creature. But Mongolians also believe that hedgehogs could be used to ward off bad things, and so place their skins over the doorway. In Europe, hedgehogs have been believed to steal apples and mushrooms and then scurry off with them to hide them somewhere. And in an old text, Pliny's Naturalis Historia, written back before AD 79, that it mentions hedgehogs gathering grapes on their spines. And you can see this illustration on the screen shows a hedgehog rolling over an apple and running away with it, looking very cheeky. So there's quite a few texts that show this sort of imagery. During medieval times in the UK, it was believed by farmers that hedgehogs was stealing milk from their cows and stealing eggs from their chickens. And there is some truth to this. Hedgehogs will eat eggs, but they can't actually crack open a chicken egg. They haven't got the strength, so they're probably, in this context, were finding damaged or broken eggs. So they may well have eaten those. So during, in association with these fears, there was a desire in the UK to eradicate hedgehogs. And in 1566, there was a 3p bounty was placed by the English Parliament on the head of each hedgehog that was caught and killed. And this was part of the Vermin Act. And the church too offered its own bounties for the slaughter of hedgehogs. And it's thought about 500,000 hedgehogs were killed between 1660 and 1800, which is fairly shocking. But then in 1905, Beatrix Potter's Mrs. Tiddlywinkle was published, and it kind of established hedgehogs as a bit of a British favourite, and they've stayed up. They've become a real favourite of everybody now. I think that everyone associates hedgehogs with the countryside and Miss Tiddlywinkle. So we've definitely turned a corner in how we feel about hedgehogs. Oh. There we go, that's the one I'm looking for. So this is to show the sort of food that hedgehogs eat. This is a study that studied the stomach contents of roadkill. And it can change depending on the time of year. So you can see in this one that they eat an awful lot of beetles and earwigs and caterpillars, but at certain times of year, certainly in the spring, where you're getting a lot of grubs coming up from underground, you'll find more things like a leather jacket grubs in what they're eating. So it depends very much on what time of year it is. But it's interesting to see that snails are quite low on their diet, and slugs aren't even on there, which is something that we always think that hedgehogs eat lots of snails and slugs, which they do, but in comparison they eat far more beetles and earwigs and worms and things like that, which is quite interesting. They're omnivorous, but they mainly eat invertebrates, but they will also eat anything they come across. They're opportunists, so they might eat small mammals, baby birds, bird eggs, amphibians, fruit, and they've even been known to eat snakes, but I'm going to assume that was probably a dead snake already. Sometimes people worry that if they're feeding hedgehogs in their garden, that they might make them dependent on that food source, and then worry that if they stop feeding them, that those hedgehogs will die. But there have been studies around that suggest that they only use that sort of food as a supplement. They're not relying on it. They use it to supplement their natural diet, so we don't have to worry too much about that. Oop. So the behaviour. Well, we're all aware that hedgehogs are nocturnal. They come out at night, and that's one of the signs that we know that hedgehogs are in trouble, is if we see them during the day. They're also solitary, except for when you rarely see a mother with her young. They don't spend time together. They don't coexist, and in fact they're not very social at all. If they come across each other, they're pretty grumpy, but they're not territorial. So you'll get a large number of hedgehogs in one area. They'll try and avoid each other, but they don't fight over the space really. They may get a bit grumpy with each other in competition for females and food, but they don't. They just rather stay away from each other, to be honest. They've got poor eyesight, so they're relying very much on their sound and their smell, which works well at night time as well. Breeding, hedgehogs can breed from when they're 2 years old, which is, if you remember earlier saying that that they on average last about 3 years. So most hedgehogs probably only have one brood in their third year, second and third year, and then that's it. So it's not a great survival rate. They start breeding in May, and the courtship is pretty noisy, pretty grueling. Not particularly pleasant, I don't think, for anyone involved. There's a lot of rebuffing, lots of advancing. The males sort of attempt to woo the females in a very lengthy encounter, and it involves circling and rhythmic snorting and puffing. It's none of that lovely sort of snuffling that we all imagine hedgehogs do all the time. And the commotion often attracts rival males, so that then they end up having a kind of, headbutting each other and chasing each other away, and then trying to get back to chase the female again. So it's not a particularly pleasant courtship. I've heard it once before when I've woken up in the middle of the night, and the noise was so loud that I actually thought it was badgers fighting. And then I looked out my window and I just saw two hedgehogs circling each other, making the most ridiculous noise. It's certainly not picture perfect. Hoglets are born in June. The average litter size is about 4 to 5, and roughly 2/3 of those hoglets die each year. So it's, again, there's a lot stacked up against hedgehogs. The nests are liable to be deserted if they're disturbed. So if you are aware of hedgehogs in your garden having young, or if you ever come across young, it's best to stay well away, because if the female has any concerns, she'll just abandon the nest, and she may even kill the hoglets. So it's really important that if you know that there's a nest nearby, you stay well away. Hoglets leave the nest to forage with mum at about 3 to 4 weeks, and they're independent at 5 to 6 weeks. So around now, hogs are starting to find partners and starting to make nests. But the females are capable of having a second litter in September or October. But these young are less likely to survive. They're often the ones that you find in the autumn struggling and underweight. And experts think that it's just not our warm season in the UK is just not long enough really for hedgehogs to have 2 broods. So unfortunately, that second brood often is the one that struggles to get through the winter. So hibernation. So they typically hibernate between kind of October, November through to March, April, depending on what the weather's like. A well-fed male could go into hibernation as early as September if it's very cold, whereas females tend to stay out a little bit later because they've got to put on that extra weight after rearing young. So you might see them out a bit later in the year. But if it's really mild, you could still see hedgehogs in November, December. It really does depend on the weather. They drop their body temperature to match their surroundings, and their metabolic rate reduces, and they're using those fat reserves as energy to get through the winter. Often in the winter, they can change where they're hibernating, or if it's a mild spell, they sometimes come out to look for food, but this really does deplete their energy. So really, hedgehogs need to have a really cold weather, consistent cold winter, so that they stay asleep for the whole period, rather than getting up and having a look for food again, because it just depletes their energy when there isn't really an awful lot of food around for them to eat, which is often why sometimes it's suggested that we carry on feeding hedgehogs through the winter, particularly during mild spells. So nests, they don't just have one type of nest, as with many things like bats and other species. They've got different types of nest. So they'll have a day nest, which could just be where they spend one night, or one night every 3 weeks, depending on how often they're in that area, and it can just be a pile of leaves. They have maternity nests, which are more sturdy to protect the young. And then they have hibernation nests. These are very stable because they need to last the winter. They're often under brambles to provide some protection. They're tightly woven with very thick walls. They can be several centimetres thick, and they can have leaves, twigs, grass, and other plants in there. And they can measure up to 60 centimetres in diameter, so they're pretty hefty. And they take about 1 to 4 days to make. So if you've got a hedgehog doing an awful lot of activity over a number of nights in your garden, it can often mean that they're creating a nest, because they're taking a few days to sort that out. The Hibernacular is waterproof and very well insulated. So studies have shown that the temperature inside a hibernaculum can remain between 1 and 5 degrees, despite fluctuations in the ambient temperature between -8 and 10. So they're considering it's made from essentially leaves. They're very, very efficient. So habitat. So they're found almost everywhere in the UK. There's only a few habitats that you won't find hedgehogs. So they don't like moorland, marshes, and pine forest are the main ones, really. And these just essentially because they're not good habitat for forming nests. So they need dense scrub for hibernation. They need short grass for foraging. Sometimes they also need long grass for foraging and for summer nests. They need that leaf litter for collecting for nest material. They need log piles, decaying veg, so that they can forage for grubs and insects. Hedgerows and boundary vegetation are the kind of corridors they use to travel between nesting sites and food places. So they need that real kind of, we always say it, that sort of mosaic of different habitats for where they nest and where they feed and how they get between the two. So there are limiting factors as to where you sometimes can find them. If there's not enough nesting material, so for example, if the leaves are too big or too small, so sycamore leaves are too big, they can't use that for nesting, and something like willow is too small, they wouldn't bother collecting willow leaves. And you need that available structure for building nest underneath, so thinking about brambles, which is why it's really important to keep brambles, and I'll talk about that later. So things like coniferous forest, where you've got and pine forest and things like that, they just haven't got the suitable leaf litter, and moorland and marsh don't provide the leaves or the structure for nest building, so that's why you're not finding those in hedgehogs in those areas. And they can be entirely absent in arable areas, despite thinking that they're associated with hedgerows and the insects that you might find on the side of fields. It's actually a habitat where you might not find very many hedgehogs, simply because fields are getting bigger and hedgerows are getting gappier. But you can find them quite often around towns and villages. It's becoming kind of an excellent habitat for hedgehogs these days, and that you'll find them more often in urban areas than you will on farmland. So this looks like a bit of a muddle, but it's quite an interesting slide. So this shows a study from 1980 where a hedgehog was tagged, and they measured and they showed where they were traveling. So this is a male hedgehog, and it's recordings over a 12-night stint. And this is a 40-hectare, 18-hole golf course. And just in case you can't read, we're on a screen. We're not in a building where people can't see the screen. But the red dots there are the centres of activity, and the green dots are nest sites where they've spent the odd night. But it just shows you what a large area this hedgehog has been foraging over an almost 2-week period. So the stats sort of suggested they were doing an average of 2 kilometres a night travelling, and males can actually travel up to 3 kilometres in a breeding season. So it's a huge area. And up in the top left of the picture, you can just see a row of terraced houses and gardens. And you can see that the hedgehog's been going into those. So there's probably a bit of, someone might have been giving them food. But even though they've had access to gardens there, you can see the majority of their foraging is across this huge 40-hectare golf course. And just to give you a bit of context on that one, here is that golf course in a larger area with the housing. You can see all the different estates around it. And so despite the fact that there are all those gardens and right on top of the golf course, you can see what a large area that it is preferring. And I think essentially that's just saying that hedgehogs need more than gardens to forage in. They need a really large area to find enough food, especially if you're going to have more than one hedgehog in these areas. They do need a very large area. Right. So on to population status, sort of bit of the sad bits. So there's a recent State of Britain's Hedgehog report done just a month ago, I think, and there's been a few reports produced by the People's Trust for Endangered Species and the British Hedgehog Preservation Society. And essentially what they've shown is that since 2000, rural populations of hedgehogs have declined by at least half, and it's probably a lot more than that now, and urban populations by up to a third. That's from the 2018 report. And in the 2022 report, it shows that rural populations are still in decline, still going down significantly. But a little glimmer of hope is that urban populations have stabilised between that 2018 and 2022 report, and then may even be on the rise, which is really, really encouraging, because they're seeing such huge drastic drop in population to show that actually in urban areas they're starting to recover potentially is really encouraging. And I don't know quite, we don't quite know what that's about, but I would imagine that a lot of it will be about awareness raising, and people now know that feeding and helping hedgehogs to find hibernation spaces is really important, and creating access into gardens is really important. We'll go through all these things again later, but I'm sure, I'd like to think that stabilisation may be because individuals and communities are coming together to make a difference for hedgehogs. It's difficult to estimate populations. It's very hard to estimate a population, something that comes out at night. But the reports that this report, has used roadkill surveys and garden surveys to come up with an estimate around the UK. And it's estimating that there's fewer than 1 million left in the UK, which is it's hard to estimate, but that's, it's fewer than 1 million. And to put that into some context, there are 41 million moles in the UK, and that's the nearest relative to hedgehogs. There's about 580,000 brown hares. That's a species that doesn't do quite so well in some areas. And there are 875,000 water voles, and that's probably the most relatable, because water voles have seen a population decline of about 90% in recent years. So both those species are seeing a huge population dive, and that's a really, 875,000 is a really low number. So it shows that hedgehogs are on a similar trend. So what are the causes of this decline? Well, there are a wide range of threats. It's not just one thing. And it's important to note that hedgehogs are declining across their range. It doesn't matter if we're talking about Central Park in Plymouth, or Yarner Woods in East Dartmoor, North England, East England, Wales, Scotland. Hedgehogs are seeing a decline everywhere. So that it's very hard to then pinpoint, one specific reason. But if there were going to be a primary cause, it would be loss of habitat and fragmentation of habitat, which is obviously something that's affecting most species, and is the cause of most decline of species. And it simply means, there are fewer nesting and hiding opportunities, which means that the hedgehogs are more susceptible to predation from badgers and foxes and dogs. And the reason for that loss of habitat: intensification of agriculture. It reduces the quality of habitat and the quantity of habitat, and development diminishes and divides habitat. So obviously, literally breaking up habitats and making it very hard for hedgehogs to travel between those areas. And they both of these lead to a loss of hedgerows, which is obviously a very important foraging and nesting habitat for hedgehogs. We're very lucky in Devon that we have very good hedges, but it's not the case necessarily across the rest of the UK. Reduced prey availability. So we know that there is, I meant to have put these up. We know that there is that we're facing an ecological crisis when it comes to insects. Some of you may be aware of our campaign, Action for Insects, which is all about trying to tackle this. So insects are obviously, bottom of the food chain. Everything relies on them, and hedgehogs are struggling to find enough insects to survive. Things like pesticides and insecticides have a massive impact on this. Slug pellets, And our Action for Insects campaign is all about trying to tackle that. So insects are dying out up to 8 times faster than larger animals, and 41% of insects, the insect species, are facing extinction. So we're at crisis points. It's a huge issue, particularly if you're thinking about 3/4 of our food source being pollinated by insects, and all the various different animals that rely on insects to survive. It's a huge issue. And loss of habitat and overuse of pesticides are just 2 areas that are helping to create this huge potential catastrophe on the horizon. If you want to know more about our campaign, there is lots of information about Action for Insects on our website, and what people can do to help, and what we're trying to do as the Wildlife Trusts, and individually as Devon Wildlife Trust. So please do find out a bit more. So cause of decline. Continued. Roadkill is a big issue. It's estimated that about 100,000 hedgehogs are killed annually. Sorry, I'm just checking that that's not Helen telling me that you can't see me on the screen, but hopefully it's all okay. Yeah, so roadkill is a real issue, and it's not really known if that level of those numbers is sustainable. It's uncertain, but 100,000 a year is quite a significant number when you think about the number of hedgehogs that we're estimating the population to have. Impermeable boundaries is a huge issue. This isn't just thinking about fencing, but obviously all our gardens are fenced off or walled off regularly, but we're thinking about roads dividing up habitats and stopping animals getting to various places, cattle grids development, fencing, paved gardens. All these things are creating huge barriers between hedgehogs and where they want to get to. And strimming and flailing, so is one way that our hedges are starting to become more gappy, and less of a good habitat. And we as a species are addicted to being tidy. The human race likes things to be neat and tidy. We like to have nice, neat, grassy banks and neat hedges, boxed hedges, trimmed verges, clearance of brambles, paved gardens. And I know I'm being very I'm generalizing hugely here, but you see what I'm trying to say. And it's essentially marginalizing a lot of species, including hedgehogs. It makes it very difficult for them to survive. It means that there's less habitat available for insects, there's less place for hibernation. It affects all wildlife in many ways. Bonfires is obviously an issue. We're all aware of the campaigning that happens around bonfire night to try and minimize the death to hedgehogs. There's danger around ponds in people's gardens, which is double-edged really. Ponds are brilliant for hedgehogs, but also if they get stuck in them, then they drown. Strimming and flailing is a huge issue, on a commercial scale as well as on an individual scale. If you're strimming or cutting long grass, we always assume that wildlife will get out the way, but hedgehogs don't do that. They don't have that flight reflex. They essentially just roll up into a ball, and that is that's how they protect themselves. And of course, if you're strimming and you come across a rolled up hedgehog, then it's pretty disastrous. Rubbish is obviously a huge issue as well. And badgers. Badgers do eat hedgehogs. They are the main predator in the UK, and because they're the only predator that's strong enough to pull the hedgehog out of its ball. But as I stated before, hedgehogs are declining across the range, across the whole of the UK, and this includes areas where there are badgers and places where there aren't very many badgers. So it doesn't matter if badgers are there; the hedgehogs are still in decline. That isn't the main cause of their decline. The main reason is they're in the same habitat. They're looking for the same kind of food source. They both like beetles and and hedgehogs. They both like worms and beetles and snails and grubs and things like that. So they're in the same habitat looking for the same food. So they do come across each other. But of course, they've been doing that for years and years and years. They've coexisted for a long time, and both survived. It's only now, because there is such a threat to hedgehogs because of habitat loss, that this is becoming an issue. So there isn't enough habitat for all animals to be able to survive side by side so easily, and there's not enough habitat for hiding in and providing enough food. So they're coming across each other far more often, and so it's becoming an issue. But it's not thought that predation by badgers is the significant cause of decline for hedgehogs. It's very much about habitat, which is obviously something that we have control over. That we can improve habitat, we can improve creating better connected and larger habitat areas for wildlife, rather than kind of going down the route of killing one species to protect another, which is a bit bonkers, quite frankly. So how you can help. So there's lots of ways we can help. I've mentioned ponds a few times. So ponds are fantastic for all wildlife. It's one of the top things that we encourage people to put into their garden, because it helps insects, it helps amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, everything. You know, all wildlife will use a pond in a garden. But the one thing that we need to make sure is that they are accessible. So either having a ramp in there, like that photo at the bottom right, or having a very shallow area, or having stones that you can get in, then hedgehogs are able to get in, drink, and then get out again, rather than not being able to get out of a steep-sided pond, which is really important. If you have netting around allotment areas or anywhere, it's about making sure that there isn't any loose netting, and checking it regularly for hedgehogs that have got trapped. Litter picking obviously is a huge importance. Fixing and closing broken grates, having ramps out of ponds, and then it's just sort of having your eye in, really. So thinking about things where a hedgehog could get trapped. So one that I came across a few years ago now is a bowling green in Exeter, where it was reported that a hedgehog was stuck on the bowling green. And around the bowling green you get that kind of ditch where which catches the balls as they come off the green, and there was no way, once this hedgehog had fallen in, there was no way for this hedgehog to get out until someone contacted the managers of the site. So it's thinking about that, you know, where could a hedgehog get trapped, and how can I help that? Ooh, my screen is, there we go. Hedgehog safety. So we've talked about bonfires and strimming. So we always advise that bonfires are built on the day or moved on the day, so that any hedgehogs that have got into the pile to hibernate can be removed. And obviously checking before strimming, really important. This is something that we've worked on with local authorities as well, to make sure that contractors and local authorities are checking before they cut grass. There's a lot of talk about pesticides and slug control at the moment. There was actually a ban put out last year on the outdoor use of, and I'm going to say this wrong, I can't say it, metaldehyde, a pesticide that's used to control slugs on farms and in gardens. And this came into force last year, and there was a grace period up until March this year, so that people could use up what they had at home. But as of this month, it's now illegal to use that anywhere, which is really good. So if anyone does have any of that, it's best to get rid of it in the local authority waste facility. So that's one thing that's been done by the government. Finding alternatives to pesticides and to slug pellets is obviously the ideal. Encouraging other wildlife, reptiles, amphibians, birds, hedgehogs, to get rid of slugs and snails is obviously preferable. Planting slug-resistant crop varieties, selectively timing irrigation and harvest, and sowing seeds more deeply in the soil are meant to be of help. But I think the things that I've heard of that are the most useful, certainly from when I've been gardening myself, are copper barriers. So you can get, like on that plant pot on the right, you can get like this copper tape that you put around pots, and the bottom there you've got the ring that's around that plant. When a slug goes over copper, it's supposed to give it it's like an electric shock so that it sends it backwards. So that's meant to be the most effective way of keeping slugs and snails away from your specific plants. And beer traps, you know, is really efficient as well. It's just about doing it safely so that it doesn't trap other insects. So putting a trap into the ground with just the rim available, putting some nice cheap beer in there, and then covering it. So in that photo you can see there's a plastic plant plate that you can put over the top, which a slug would remove. It would be able to slide underneath, but other insects can't get under it, so that's probably the best way to do it. One of the best things and most important things that that anyone can do is to make sure that your garden is accessible, and that there are connections between gardens. So I used to live on a terrace, a Victorian terrace, where it was all walled gardens and there was absolutely no entry point for anybody. And I put a hole in my gate, but I could not for love nor money get my neighbours to even put a hole in their gate. So it's hard work trying to make sure that, you know, a row of houses has a connected garden system. But as an individual, making sure that there is access to your garden is probably the best thing you can do to help hedgehogs. And if you can work with your neighbours and your community to create access points between gardens, that's fantastic as well. The minimum size that you need is about 5 inches squared, or about 13 centimeters by 13. And you can, and to put it into a fence or take a couple of bricks out of a wall, it's a bit more difficult. It's the best thing that you can do. I really encourage everyone to get involved in that. Onto their diet. So we were all, as children, told to feed hedgehogs. In fact, my favourite storybook as a child told me about milk and bread for hedgehogs. But these are no good for hedgehogs. Hedgehogs are lactose intolerant. So if they eat milk, they obviously get a bad tummy. That could be detrimental at the wrong time of year if they're trying to put on weight. And bread just fills them up. There's no nutritional value, no energy that they get from it. So it's a completely pointless food to give to a hedgehog. So the best things to give them is meaty foods, cat foods, dog foods, either dry or wet, as long as it's not fishy. And to possibly, if possible, feed all year round, or at the very least during cold spells in the winter as well, so that if they are coming out, they've got food nearby. Just having water. Mealworms is also not recommended because it can cause bone disease, metabolic bone disease. So that's also not recommended for hedgehogs. And if there's a concern that the neighbourhood cats are all flocking to your garden for all this food, you can create a kind of feeding station like the one in the bottom right-hand corner there, either creating a kind of a brick area, or using a hedgehog home, or making something like this with this plastic box so that only hedgehogs can get in. I've mentioned insects quite a lot, but one of the best ways that you can attract hedgehogs to your garden is to help insects. So some of the best ways to do that is about including as much variety as possible in terms of planting. So thinking about flowers that flower throughout all seasons. So there are different species that you can get that flower early and late into the season, so that you're attracting as many insects as possible across the whole year. Thinking about variety of shape of those flowers, because different insects feed from different shaped flowers. And thinking about different colours as well, because certain insects are attracted to different coloured flowers. So it's just constantly thinking about variety and providing as many different sources of pollen and nectar and hiding opportunities within those plants. The RHS has a perfect for pollinators list, and often in their shops as well, you'll find that sticker on things that are really good for pollinators. So it's worth looking into that. We've also got it on our website. I think we have a list of species of plant species that provide seasonal flowering, and obviously being kind to those weeds, as particularly things like dandelions, which are the banana of the weed world for bees. They provide continuous source of nectar. They keep producing, so they're a fantastic source of nectar for insects. Again, on the theme of insects, providing log homes, log piles, really useful for loads of different species, including things like stag beetle, and lots of insects will either hibernate in there or have their larvae nest. They'll lay their eggs and larvae will grow up in there, and essentially you're just producing a buffet for hedgehogs in that sense. Nettles are really good for keeping, because you attract certain species like red admiral butterflies that lay their eggs on there. retaining overwintering stems for grubs and eggs and bees, leaf cutters, is really important. And avoiding bedding plants is something that everyone can do as well. There is a place for bedding plants, and I wouldn't say don't have them, but things like busy lizzies and begonias and petunias, they don't provide any nectar or pollen. So from an insect point of view, they're pointless. They don't provide anything. So it's always good to try and provide additional things that does provide that food source. And the age-old having a wild corner as well to allow animals to find shelter and food. We talked about ponds being really important, so I won't go over that again. Keeping a messy corner with leaf litter. Obviously, if you clear up all your leaves, then there's not very much there for hedgehogs to make their hibernaculums, but also you'll get loads of insects in leaf litter. And log piles. So we've covered that all already, really. In the wider landscape, it's all about creating connections and vary, you know, that mosaic of habitats. So we do an awful lot of work on hedge restoration. So if you happen to have hedges that are getting a bit gappy, we definitely encourage you to replant them and encourage them to be to connect better to the land with other hedgerows, and having those fantastic wide corridor meadow corridors along the edges and ditches are all really important corridors for hedgehogs. I've got a cattle grid there. Sorry, I completely had a mind blank there. Cattle grids are obviously, they create a barrier in themselves, but they also, once a hedgehog's fallen into them, they're often stuck. So you can see in the bottom right corner of that one, there is a ramp to get out, and that is really important. And it's very rare that I see cattle grids with ramps in them. So it's something that's worth considering if you happen to have a cattle grid on your land. I'd also say I've mentioned bramble a few times today. Brambles are really important to loads of wildlife, and I think it's not about, I'm not advocating everyone letting their brambles go bonkers and taking over, but I'd certainly suggest that if management's been done, that it's cut in rotation. So say over a 3-year period, you cut a third each year. Which is actually really good for the bramble and the wildlife as well, because some species really like new growth and some species really like old growth. So actually, by doing that rotation, you're helping a variety of animals as well, and in doing so, ensuring that you've got this continuous source of hibernation protection for hedgehogs. It was really, one way of there it is. One way of seeing if you've got hedgehogs in your garden or on your land. The most obvious is often those poos, those nice black shiny poos. Is usually the only sign that most people will see in their garden, and they're this black shiny color because of the beetle casings that you find in them, so they're very distinct. I suppose the closest that I would say is otter poo, but you're not going to find otter poo often in a garden, so if you're finding that kind of really deep black poo, it's going to be hedgehog. Getting a camera, fantastic, and doing some kind of footprint trap is really good. It's good fun as well. You can see the footprints there on the left hand side, which I always think that look like little miniature handprints. They're pretty adorable. You can buy footprint traps online, or you can create your own just using cardboard, and then what you need is something long enough that in the middle you can put your food source, so putting some cat biscuits or something in the middle. Then either side of that you mix up a bit of charcoal and vegetable oil, and put it on some duct tape or something, so that they have to cross over it to get to the food, and then either side of that you put the paper, so that when they leave they have to pass over it, and then you have these prints, and you'll find you'll get shrews and voles and mice as well, and if you're lucky enough you'll get hedgehogs as well. And then I think I've just got a very short piece of a hedgehog just to show them crossing over someone's garden. I always think it looks like it's got a little skirt. Huh. There we go, just a little bit. Oh, and I'm starting again. There we go. So how can we all take action? So there are a few things you can do. Obviously, we've talked about access as being a really, really key and important part, and I'm sure that's why we're starting to see potential change in urban areas, because more people are making their gardens accessible, more developers are getting on board with creating accessible gardens. Having those areas of scrub and everything that we've talked about. On our website, we have a page called Help the Hog, which encourages everyone to be a hedgehog champion and to get involved and to spread the news of how we can all help hedgehogs. And as part of that, you can see this poster with these things that you can tick off, and I certainly encourage everyone to try and tick off everything on that list and have a look on our website on that page. It's connected to the Hedgehog Street, which is done by the British Hedgehog Preservation Society. And encourages everyone to record what they're finding. So if you want to record hedgehog sightings in Devon, we really encourage you to go onto the Devon Biodiversity Reference. Sorry, the Biodiversity. Why can't I? Devon Biodiversity Record Centre, my goodness, and put your records in there for hedgehogs that you've seen, and to also let Hedgehog Street know of the things that you're doing so we can start to record what's happening. So Hedgehog Street are sending us all their records, so you can also submit everything on there, and then they send it to us to upload to DBRC as well. So it's a good way of getting involved and seeing what people are doing around the whole of the UK. Hedgehog care, we often get asked about who people should contact. So as a trust, we aren't able to take hedgehogs. Obviously, we can't take any wildlife. We don't have the facilities to care for them. But there is always information that comes out every autumn about keeping an eye out for hedgehogs, and here are just a few of the things to look out for. Essentially, if they are underweight, they need looking after, and if they're out during the day or visibly poorly, they need to be looked after. But the one thing to think about is that at this time of year and into the summer, if you see a female around, she might be looking for nesting material or food, or just getting a break from the nest. So if you see a hedgehog out during the day and it's looking pretty it's moving purposefully and it's not out for very long, don't worry, it's probably a female. It's when you're starting to see lethargic hedgehogs out during the day, or if they're poorly, or if they're flea infested, that's when you need to think about contacting someone. And there is a number there for the British Hedgehog Preservation Society. It's always got to call them to find out who the local carers are. We don't have that information on board because it changes so often, so it's always best to contact them and collect up and they'll give you advice about how to collect up the hedgehog and things like that. I've realised we've got literally 10 minutes. I'm very sorry, but are there any questions, Helen, that's come up from that?
Oh, right. Yeah. Thank you, Emily. Wow, there was so much information in your talk. I might have to watch the recording again to get all the information, but that was absolutely brilliant, really comprehensive. Do you want to stop sharing your talk?
Oh, sorry, yes.
And then I've got a couple of questions that have come up. One is, I don't know if there's an answer to this. How do you stop rats getting to any food that you put out for hedgehogs? I'm thinking that you can't really.
That is a very good question. I was focusing on how you stop cats. I don't really think about it, because we have the same issue with rats and mice when people are feeding birds. So it's probably becoming more of an issue these days as everyone's desperately trying to help wildlife in their garden. But of course, that attracts other small rodents and mammals as well. So the short answer is, I don't think you can.
I think the rats, they're going to be there anyway. I'm not sure putting out food will encourage them more, because they tend to be around, don't they, all the time anyway. We put an upturned wooden crate in our garden as a hedgehog feeding station, and we cut a hole so it does stop larger animals going in, but obviously you've got to allow the hedgehog to get in. And that was really effective. I didn't realise that you could give dry pet food though. I was like buying tins. I thought it had to be wet, but you can put dry
yes, you can.
Food pellets
the wet stuff's best, I think, but you can mix it with some hard stuff, or if you've only got hard stuff, that's fine. I've used that in the garden, and it's been wolfed down. And if there's water out already, that's the main issue. So as long as you've got water there as well, then it's all good. And
we also found once they were coming to the garden, we didn't need a camera. We could just go and sit outside as it was getting dark. And then you hear like this rustling in the bushes, and then out they come. And the other thing I was really amazed by is how speedy they are. Like, they can get down steps. I was like, how do they get down the steps in our garden? They just, like, they've got really long legs, haven't they? They just like go down really fast, much faster than you imagine that they can move.
Yeah, definitely.
So I've got another question. Do hedgehogs eat ladybirds? I'm guessing they probably would. Do you know?
I would imagine so. I don't see why they wouldn't. Yeah, I'm going to go with they do.
Anything and everything by the list that you had.
And they'll certainly, if they're finding their larvae around, the little ones that we see around, they'll certainly eat those. So
yeah. I've got this is an interesting one. This sounds a bit might be a bit too complicated, but if New Zealand regard our European hedgehogs as pests, could we somehow have an arrangement with them to repatriate them, seeing as we've got such a massive decline in populations? But I'm not sure that how practical that would be.
I really like that thinking. I really do. I was, as I said it, I was like, someone's going to suggest that. I don't know if it's a possibility. I might. I'm sure that. I wonder if the British Hedgehogs Preservation Society had been asked that. I might ask, see what they say. They probably say something along the lines of, you know, if we start bringing them back, they'll probably bring non-native like fleas back or something, and then we have, you know, we'll because that's one of the biggest issues is introduction of species to different countries. Maybe they bring something back. I don't know.
Also, but, the same person, Andrea, suggested maybe let's have a crowdfunder to bring our hogs home.
I like that a lot.
Andrea, you can set that up. I'll contribute to that. I was just also going to say that you can, those footprint traps are quite easy to make. You can, I think, probably look online for DIY, but you could do it with a large piece of cardboard as well. We all got loads of cardboard packaging, haven't we, with all our online deliveries, and you can sort of score it and fold it and cut it into that triangular shape. And I think that the charcoal you need is a special kind of charcoal.
I ordered it online,
like a wildlife survey specialist company, so that might be something to look out for. But it is a really fun thing to do, especially if you've got children. Do that with children. If has anyone got any other questions to pop in the chat? We've got a couple of minutes left. Otherwise, please pop any feedback in the chat. If you enjoyed it, if you didn't, if you are going to do anything as a result of the talk, that would be lovely to know. And yeah, and I'll just see if there's any other questions coming in.
NHBS, which nhbs.com, you can get the charcoal from there, which is where you can get loads of different wildlife. We get a lot of our scientific
survey equipment from them, and they're actually based in Totnes as well, so quite local.
Yeah, they are nice and local, which is good.
Yeah, and we'll put, what we will do is put everything, the recording, some details about the recording, and also some links to some of the things we've mentioned, like the Devon Biodiversity Record Centre, how to link so you can record any wildlife, not just hedgehogs that you see. We'll put that in a follow-up email to everyone. Someone is saying they're definitely going to start feeding the hedgehogs and asking their neighbours to put holes in fences. Yay, great. And so actually, Catherine, there, if you sign up to the Help a Hog thing on the Devon Wildlife Trust website, you can get sent a little pack of information. I think that's still going on, isn't it, Emily?
It is, yeah.
You get some little leaflets that are like the same size as the hole you need, and you can pop them round to your neighbours and get everyone involved. So that's a really nice thing to do. But yeah, if there's nothing else, there's a few nice comments. Brilliant, thank you. Have you had any chat to you directly?
Oh, goodness, I've just seen that there are things on there and I haven't even looked.
Is that really to you though, or it might just be that they most have come direct to me? Someone says another great session, off to add cat food to their shopping order and see what they get. So that's lovely. We hope that you've enjoyed that.
Someone's saying about buying nematodes to help control slugs.
Okay. Do we,
another,
that's natural sort of pest control, isn't it?
yes, I think it is. I need to look into that.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
everything else, I don't think there are other questions there, but some very nice comments. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, and considering you hadn't done an online talk for ages, I thought that was brilliant, and thank you so much.
I wanted to kind of move about a bit too
well,
much.
you could do that.
Anyway, thank you,
Yeah,
guys.
well, we've had at the most, we had 54 people on watching that talk, so it's really great to be able to sort of spread our messages and our enthusiasm for how we can all, rather than despair too much about what is a bit of a crisis, actually we can all together take some positive action to help hedgehogs and all the other wildlife in our own patches, in our villages, and maybe in towns, and just getting involved in that. So yeah, I'll just let's say good night, everybody, and thank you very much for joining.